All right, so I got my beer. On this monologue, I want to discuss the differences between Western cultures in general and the Middle Eastern cultures in general. So sit back and relax. And this very monologue comes from the whole idea that it was a good idea to import a bunch of refugees from the Middle East into Europe. And now they're facing problems with this for various reasons. And the big thing is that there is a huge cultural difference between the Western Europeans and the Middle East. In fact, Europe in general and the Middle Eastern cultures. There's a huge divide in those two cultures. One of the biggest differences is government. Governance, how we keep order, rule of law. You see, in the West, civil authority is our highest authority. You know, our elected officials, our mayors, our governors, our legislatures, our president. These are all considered the deciding factors when it comes to law and governance here in the West. Whereas in the Middle East, tribal government tends to have the greater say. One of the big mistakes we made in Iraq when we invaded and we were setting up a government we were building there is we put too much faith in the civil government. The civil government didn't quite have the same influence that the tribal governments had over the people. The tribal governments were considered the legitimate rule of law there. Now, Saddam Hussein understood this and he took advantage of it. When we ousted him, well, we didn't quite understand that at the time. And it wasn't until we started reaching out to the sheikhs as opposed to the muqtars, or, the tribal leaders as opposed to the civil leaders in the area, that we were able to make some headway. When we were able and figured out that we needed to be working with the sheikhs a lot more, things started going a bit better for us. The whole human life and family honor. We have different views on that here in the West than they do in the Middle East, and vice versa. You see, here in the West, Katie can be a dirty little slut who has daddy issues, that hates her dad and, has 5 different babies from 3 different daddies. And while daddy might be disappointed in her, well, he certainly doesn't want to see her stoned to death either and would vocally oppose that. Versus the Middle East, where if little Katie was little Shazi or something like that, and even slept with somebody outside of marriage, well, our family would be a little bit more open to an honor killing. And this goes the same way with, say, little Jimmy here in the U.S. or in any Western country. They might be little Jimmy might be a complete smackhead, a complete crack smoker, who can't hold a job, who is always asking for money. And here in the West, we're going to try, generally speaking, to send him to rehab to get him over the addiction. Versus if he was little Ahmed in the Middle East, they might have him strap on an S-vest and go blow up the infidels to regain his honor and his place in paradise. Also noting, little Lance here in the U.S., who isn't really interested in girls, but he is interested in guys, well, we're generally a lot more tolerant of it and a lot more accepting of it. Even our evangelical Christian preachers here in the West are going to try maybe to convert him and save his soul and everything like that, as opposed to, say, in the Middle East, throw him off a building. So we can see this pronounced difference here in the West as well. Another pronounced difference between the West and the Middle East is that here in the West, we believe in a separation of church and state, versus in the Middle East, they're more tolerant of, or even more supportive of, a single church and state. And this goes back into the Islamic culture. If you read the Hadith, the life of Muhammad, uh, he did several different things. He was a banker, a military leader, and he did a whole bunch of other things. So when you understand that portion of Muhammad's life, you can understand why in more Middle Eastern Islamic cultures, they see no divide between the church and state, or very little divide between the church and state. They don't see the separation of church and state as a good thing. This is why in some Middle Eastern countries you'll have what's called Sharia law, versus you will not see a single Western country with Levitican law. And even some of our more Bible-belted politicians generally understand that there is a separation of church and state. In fact, the last politician who said something controversial in regards to church and state, more or less, that Republican representative who said that if a woman got raped, and got pregnant, it's really more of God wanted her to get pregnant. He got voted out of office. So here in the West, we generally support a separation of church and state, versus in the Middle East, they're less likely to support it, and actually more likely to be supportive of a single church and state. Well, they believe that the church should be the state. The family structure in the Middle East is a tad bit different than it is in the West in many ways. You see, in the Middle East, homosexual marriage is prohibited, versus in the West, it's actually allowed, generally speaking. When it comes to wives in the Middle East, a man can take up to 4 wives, provided he has permission from the first wife to take on subsequent wives. That man can have up to 4 wives. In the West, we tend to look down upon that. In fact, I think it's illegal here. In fact, it is illegal here, I should say. So there's a bit of a difference there. Another pronounced cultural difference we have in the West versus the Middle East is our male to female interactions. You see, here in the US, as a male, you can go talk to other females, you can shake their hands. They don't have to be a relative or your spouse or anything like that. You can go up and give them a hug or something like that, and that's perfectly acceptable in Western culture. When you get into Middle Eastern culture, that's a bit more frowned upon, to say the least. In fact, a good rule of thumb to follow in the Middle East is if that female is not your relative as a male, don't touch her. If you're a female in the Middle East, if that guy isn't a relative, you don't touch him. You don't have conversations with them. They're generally speaking not your friend. Whereas in the US, it's perfectly okay to have platonic friendships between males and females. Over in the Middle East, it's a bit more frowned upon. Yes, in the West, male to female friendships or female to male friendships are perfectly okay and acceptable. In the Middle East, it's a little bit of a different story. Another pronounced difference between the cultures is that there are a lot of things that we consider spousal abuse in the West that are part of their everyday life in the Middle East. I'm going to bring up an experience from Iraq I had, just to highlight the differences in our cultures and the way we see things. You see, this is a part when I was still married, and I ended up on a military integration transition team, or a MIT. And basically what that is that we helped build the Iraqi army back up. We stayed with them. We held their hand through operations. We advised them. We helped supply them everything you need to try to get that army going again. Our interpreter was not on the U.S. payroll. He was on the Iraqi army payroll. And needless to say, whenever we went back to a U.S. fob or a cob and he was with us, he had to be under escort, meaning he could not leave one of our sites. So usually what happened, in fact, this is pretty much what happened all the time while I was on the Met. I was the lowest ranking guys. I'd have his pistol, his cell phone, and I would pretty much walk around with him everywhere he went. We go to chow on the fob or the cob, and which we always love doing that. Go to the MWR sometimes when we're there, and we pretty much became as much of a friend as you can, between a U.S. soldier and an Iraqi interpreter, to say the least. One day, I was escorting him around on the cob, and of course, I'd just gotten into an argument with my ex-wife a little bit beforehand. Well, my now ex-wife. At the time, she was my wife. But anyway, this interpreter asked me, well, hey, man, what's going on? I can tell something's wrong. I'm like, man, I don't want to talk about it. He's like, come on, man. How long have we known each other? We're good friends. I'm like, man, you really don't want to hear it? He's like, no, I do. I'm like, well, dude, my wife and I are having a little bit of issues here. She wants to act stupid. And, of course, the interpreter responded with, isn't she afraid you're going to beat her ass? My response was, well, men in the U.S., we don't do that to our wives. His response was, and he was very animated at this point when he said that. He's like, no, this is nonsense. I am the head of the household. As a husband, we are the heads of households. Our wives do what we say. Otherwise, we're supposed to beat their ass. Wife does not talk back. Otherwise, I beat her ass. When I'm home, my wife has dinner ready every night at 6 o'clock. Otherwise, I beat her ass. And before I could say anything, he's giving me the whole spiel about the husband's place and the wife's place, which is an entirely different notion than what we have over here in the West. In many respects. And, I've ended up telling a few people back here about what our interpreter said to me there. And there are a lot of people that were very disgusted with his behavior. Now, what we don't understand is that this is what he's grown up with. This is how he sees things to be. These are the values that he grew up with, which is completely different than the values we grew up with here. So no, he's not a bad guy. It's just that's the culture he was raised in. And yes, he has come back from home with swollen knuckles from beating his wife. And yes, you have people I've mentioned this to here in the U.S. and the West that were appalled by that, who would ask me, how on earth could you think of that guy as your friend, who wanted to beat the hell out of him? But the fact of the matter is that's what he knows. We have two different standards when it comes to culture and behavior and how we treat our families. There's a different view. And it doesn't mean I hate the guy. I think the guy was a pretty cool guy. And I think that a lot of us, if we grew up in the same environment and the same culture he did, we would think like him. Vice versa, I think, if he grew up in the U.S. as opposed to the Middle East and U.S. culture and Western culture, he would think a little bit more closely to how we think. And while I don't hate the guy or dislike the guy for being from a different culture, there is an issue when it comes to culture and mass immigration. When you have a whole influx of people from one country that move to another country to where they don't understand the culture and the customs, and there's a night and day difference between the cultures and customs in their own home country versus the country they're going to, you're going to have problems. And even though the current issue of the day is, or it seems to be anyway, the issue of refugees from the Middle East into Europe and the problems those are causing, this can stem from other cultures as well. I mean, even from, say, Europe to the United States, if there was a mass influx of European immigrants to the U.S., I think there would be issues there too. In fact, there would be issues there too, because even though maybe the U.S. and Europe are more similar in cultures than, say, the West and the Middle East, there are still cultural differences between the U.S. and Europe. So I think there would be a lot of issues to cover with people migrating from Europe to the U.S., vice versa. This is why we have borders. This is why we have immigration laws. This is why having a mass immigration from one country to the next can create problems. Anyway, for those who have been following me and watching along for this long, I appreciate. I hope this has given you a little bit more information to work with. I hope that you guys take this and are able to integrate this information into your own thought process. Y'all take her easy out there and have a great day.